Today on the Communicative Leader, we welcome Scott Shank, who is a PhD candidate at Michigan State University. Scott uses both qualitative and quantitative approaches to understand and explain the efficacy of leader communication, social support, and social influence to enhance or undermine newcomer adjustment, leader-member relationships, and workgroup performance. In this episode, we look at some of our recent research on manager metaphors. Are you a lion, a coach, or the Anti-Midas? And of course, Scott leaves us with concrete, applied leadership communication takeaways. Hello, and welcome to the Communicative Leader, hosted by me, Dr. Leah O'Million-Hodges. My friends call me Dr. O. I'm a professor of communication and a leadership communication expert. On the Communicative Leader, we're working to make your work life what you want it to be. So Scott, thank you for joining us today on the Communicative Leader. I am thrilled to have you, and that is an understatement. But before we dive into this fun conversation, can you give us a little background on yourself, your connection to leadership communication?
Yeah, absolutely. So I have been studying leadership communication for a long time. I've been in various positions that have relied on leadership for quite a bit. In fact, I've even taken leadership classes at Western Michigan University with the one and only Dr. Leah O'Million-Hodges.
You don't say.
Yeah, so it's I guess for the audiences, I had the question of I love people, I love interacting with people, and I found that almost getting anything done requires social influence. So I tend to be a very relational type of person, not liking to kind of appeal to authority or to position. So that has involved figuring out, how do I communicate to inspire people? How do I communicate to motivate people? And most of my leadership context has been working with people in a more developmental capacity. So I worked with college students as a pastor for many years. I teach college courses. I may work with organizations, but most of it is within how do you help people grow and develop into different areas or competencies. So very pragmatic, which is why I think I was drawn to some of the courses you taught on persuasion and social influence, as well as leadership from a communication perspective.
Yeah, right. And I love how, and you've always done this, Scott, you've done this so well in figuring out, okay, what does the literature say? So you have these kind of data-driven suggestions and a springboard, but you don't just leave it there. Like I said, you use it as a springboard to say, how do I make these connections more authentic and more genuine and what I really want them to be? And that's something I've always admired, your ability to do, and to do it so well.
Oh, thanks. I think just curiosity in the enjoyment of solving problems and tinkering.
Yes. So speaking of tinkering, we've done a lot of research together, and we found some pretty interesting, very impactful findings. And one today I'd like us to kind of talk about in greater detail is this recent publication on evocative metaphors managers and employees use to describe managerial attempts at enacting leadership. Wow, that's a mouthful.
Yeah,
so essentially, folks, we were looking at metaphors and saying, what is your manager? And then what does that make you? And vice versa, we asked managers, what is your metaphor for managing? What does that make your team? So before we dive into this, what I think will be a really colorful chat, I'd like to ask you a few questions with the goal of leaving listeners with some practical takeaways and to kind of help them understand how we're doing this theoretical leadership communication work, but how it really can help them in the workplace. So to start, can you kind of talk to us about the importance of metaphors and maybe how these can be more helpful than just asking someone a direct question?
I think one of the important things that metaphors have to offer is it really focuses your attention on a specific area. So I'm talking to students about how a lot of times theories are like metaphors. We're saying this is like that, or we're comparing things. So if we say something like this leader is like a lion, what it does, it draws our attention to all of the ways that the person is like a lion. But the thing about metaphors is that they're very insightful, but they also can result in some, like, I don't know, you could call it distortion, because it's focusing our attention on all of the ways the metaphor works, but we kind of we're backgrounding all of the ways. I mean, I'm sure whatever individual isn't entirely like the metaphor suggests. So I really enjoy kind of the nuance, the insight that this type of examination has to offer, because you get a lot of creative responses. So some leadership research, that I've done is very like, measuring variables specifically, looking for patterns. But when you ask someone, hey, what's a metaphor for your manager's approach to leadership? And then you just like quiet your mouth and listen. It is fantastic. The things that come out, the experiences that come to mind that may not even like be consciously articulated before, but you really get this kind of vivid and nuanced understanding of how they've experienced leadership.
Yeah, you're right, because it's so visual, and a lot of these metaphors are like hit you in a very visceral way, right? When you think about a manager who is a lion, right? There, like my first thought is, thinking about being in a enclosure with a lion and being very, very fearful. But we could also flip that, and we'll think about that later on, about how a lion can be really protective. So we have that employee experience, and we can really feel what that employee is feeling or trying to convey. Yeah, excellent. So another thing that we know, and you've kind of touched on this with your response, is a lot of research is very based on variables. We're looking at outcomes, satisfaction, commitment, turnover, all important. We know we're not knocking those, but it does gloss over the complexity of communication, the importance of those interactions that are part of being in an organization. So when we think about this, can you kind of articulate to us why it's important that we look at this process, the communication interactions, the relationships, in addition to the behavioral outcomes?
Oh, sure. Yeah, like it's so important. I think the behavioral outcomes in a lot of like quantitative research that identifies key predictors. Like I like simplicity. So it's very valuable knowing like, hey, focus on these key behaviors that result in, increased commitment or satisfaction or whatever it is we'd like to predict. But that doesn't give us kind of the quality of experience. So I think with sometimes if you look at, I mean, you can look at a process approach using some math and quantitative data, but it involves having access to how things change over time, which, research would love to have. But sometimes the easier way to get at kind of like a descriptions of the process of how people communicate is simply by asking them, tell us about your manager, tell us about your relationship with your manager, describe to us. And granted, there's like, pros and cons to all forms of research. But I think as we both appreciate the way that different approaches to observing, understanding, explaining an area of study, they're very complementary. So I think this particular article was unique in just how it shed lights and it kind of livened up a lot of, previous research that we've done, while emphasizing, the kind of more communicative, interactive. You get in some of these metaphors how interaction with a manager makes them feel. You get a lot of, sentiment, I would say. Like I kind of used by one that referred to their manager as their distant cousin. Like just think of all of the sentiment. Like I never would have thought of this, but it just leaves you with kind of this weight of pondering, what does that even mean? And so rich and so like kind of, I don't know, just it gives a little bit more vividness to these like relational things that don't always get captured when we're asking them to fill out that scale from 1 to 5.
Yeah, it's funny you say that. I was just thinking of the 1 to 5 scale, and I was like, okay, a distant cousin, is that going to be a 2? Is that going to be a 3? And certainly I almost said I was raised as a quantitative scholar, because that's how it feels, right? I did most of my training all quantitative, and then at the very end started to realize I needed to talk to people to better understand what these statistics were saying, what these patterns were saying. Um, and so you're right. We can't have, we're promoting one over another, but recognizing that there are, huge benefits to both. But in this study in particular, what we would have gotten if we just used a Likert, a 1 through 5, 1 through 7
Mm.
scale to ask about your interactions with your manager or your interactions with your employees is going to be really leaving us with a lot of questions, and understanding what those trends were, right? So, or understanding why we had those trends, right?
Yeah.
So we
And
have, like you said, sentiment here.
yeah. And to be honest, like as I was going back through our studies, I thought,
Mm-hmm.
man, it would almost be fun to do this again because
Mm-hmm.
you learn so much by asking, by the surprise of what people describe their managers as,
Mm-hmm.
and what that means for them. Because we also ask them, if your manager is fill in the blank, what
Yeah.
does that make you and the
Yep.
coworkers? So getting kind of that
Mm-hmm.
understanding of, relationship to a lion, or
Mm-hmm.
in a relationship to the pilot. I
Yep.
might be part of the crew. I could be, I think as
Mm-hmm.
one person pointed out, the cargo. Like, so
Yeah.
really, you're letting the person kind of speak in kind of
Mm-hmm.
lead where we're going. So it just feeds into the curiosity that we both have,
Mm-hmm.
which really made this study fun.
Yes. And Scott, can you remind everyone the metaphor that we used as part of the title that came from the data? Do
Oh
you
my
remember?
goodness. Yeah. Well, someone out there referred to their manager as the anti-Midas. King Midas, who everything
Mm-hmm.
that he touched turned to gold. Well, in this case, their manager was the anti-Midas, and as they
Mm-hmm.
describe, everything they touch turns to crap.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, I mean, I was shocked, humored,
Yep.
amused, but saddened, because you're like, oh my goodness,
Yeah.
this is someone's like
Yeah.
genuine experience. Granted,
Yep.
maybe they were being playful, but I mean, there's something to how they were describing this
Yeah.
person that
And
they interact with in their work.
100%. And do you remember they said, so my manager is the anti-Midas, right? Everything they
Mhm.
touch turns to crap. That makes us, right? The work group,
Mm.
this participant and their peers. I still remember the throne upon which they sit,
Yeah.
right? So
Hmm.
I mean, I don't think we could get more vivid than that in terms of being able to help someone to understand what it feels like in that particular work group from this person's perspective.
Hmm. Exactly.
Wow. So this is a really nice segue, Scott. So as a follow up, I'm wondering if you can help to explain, and I don't know, you probably get this question a lot from folks outside of communication. I know it's one I field a lot, but what is a communicative view of leadership? Well, let's
Mm-hmm.
start there, and then I have a follow up for that. So first, how do we see leadership slightly different than maybe someone in management or
Mm-hmm.
psychology or industrial and organizational psych?
Yeah. And I mean, I think we're not so much trying to identify like what specific, traits does the leader have that makes them stand out, or even like the extent to which they have a formal title. So like through
Mhm.
organizational history, you've got the formal structure of the organization, but communication scholars, when we started looking at like the communication networks, and lo and behold, we find, wow, there's a formal structure, but that's not how things get done. So I love the
Mhm.
contrast between like a structure of authority and a structure of influence. In being so
Mhm.
interested in social influence, I tend to associate communicative leadership with um, the ability to communicate, to interact strategically, to use social influence. And this could, I mean, there's a broad topic. We just, wrote a chapter on
Mhm.
framing together,
You did.
which we
Yep.
won't get into. But there are so many ways that a communication can be leveraged in a variety of different contexts. And a lot of it is really context dependent. It depends on the relationship, depends on, the organization or the unit's culture, climate. So I think to me, a communicative view is a bit more complex. It's a bit more reliant upon messages and meaning in order to influence people towards the goal, rather than maybe position or authority-based leadership, or maybe leadership that tries to identify like the key characteristics of the leader. We're very much interested in like what a leader says and does, and the consequences, both good and bad, with that.
Yeah, exactly. And a follow-up, and you've kind of touched on this too. So from a communicative view or perspective, how do we expect someone's communication to change when they move into that titled leadership position?
Wow, this is a great question because I don't know, like I'm thinking back to my own journey when I went from like a very competent individual performer to now having responsibility to like lead and influence people. And you just assume everyone else are just these competent individual performers just like you,
Yep.
committed to the organization, ready to hit the ground running. And then you realize, oh my goodness, I don't think I have what it takes to motivate people to do things that I thought were just normal and good and positive. So I would say that the expectations for how to communicate drastically change. Often, I don't think there's a lot of training in, hey, let's talk about how the relationship to your peers is now fundamentally altered now that you've received this kind of promotion and position, and how you interact with them is going to change. They're going to look at you differently. They're going to expect differently from you. And now, advice, I think sometimes is better taken from a peer. But now there are many ways I found that the position of authority somehow got in the way, became like a speed bump or stumbling block to the types of influence that I previously had when I was kind of working side by side. Not in every case. So I think that it's a new skill set. It's like motivating, inspiring, directing, learning how to not only like create or strategically like structure experience for the people you lead, but then to kind of implement and to communicate with them how to go about. I mean, it seems like it's never ending. But before, I had the satisfaction of just like, look at what I did, look at what I contributed. But now, like, your contribution to an organization isn't so easily, like, it's not as tangible, and I think that's kind of the challenge. A lot of it is like how you communicate so that others, are contributing or looking what they did. And I don't know, I could ramble on, but I think this is a very interesting kind of area. And I know I'm looking at some stuff on like socializing not new members to organizations, but new managers into their role. And I think, if this is something your audience is interested in, maybe give her a shout out on, what practically we should be looking at.
Yeah. Thank you. Such a thoughtful response, Scott. Honestly, knowing you, I would not expect anything else. But when I was listening to you, the word I kept thinking about was responsibility. Right. So your responsibility of course, with the position, but with communication changes in really large ways. You almost flip it on your head. And I think too, especially someone who's already in an organization, there's so many assumptions made. They know the culture. They've been here. They have these pre-established relationships. And we make the mistake of assuming it's going to be an easier transition. And actually, I think folks coming from the outside in, they're allotted a lot more latitude. They're allotted a lot more, oh, that's okay. You misstepped. You're new. You don't know. We don't recognize how hard communicating in that new role can be, and for all of the variety of reasons that you've addressed. So, yeah, thank you. And I love that idea of doing a episode just on that. Okay, I'm a manager now. Now what?
Now what?
What do I do? Yeah. So, Scott, we've talked about the impact of metaphors. We've chatted about importance of looking at communication in the workplace. So now let's look at the fun stuff, the data. Can you walk us through the variety of metaphors we found and kind of how we tried to make sense of them?
Yeah, I think, well, first off, if I remember, the first round of data collection happened with managers, practicing managers,
Mm-hmm.
titled managers being
Yeah.
interviewed, and I think there are
Mm-hmm.
25, 27 or so interviews. And
Mm-hmm.
that was kind of the first. And we thought, this is really interesting, right? So you have like some that, viewed themselves kind of like in control of things, like a race car driver, a pilot. Others were like, felt helpless, like time bomb. Like, really, what do you mean
Yeah.
by time bomb?
Oof.
Well, then, like,
Yeah.
we had such rich metaphors of those. We thought, wouldn't it be interesting to kind of compare and contrast this with what members think? So, unfortunately, we couldn't get like their direct reports. That would have been amazing. But we did
Mm-hmm.
get a completely different sample of people that to describe the metaphors that they would use to describe their own managers and how that positioned them in light. So I was I found it very interesting. One, the variety. Like
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there were some commonalities, but we have like the distant cousin that I mentioned. My manager is a bump on a log. Um, and my manager is like a monkey trying to lead a pack of wolves, right? So some of these are
Yep.
pretty negative. A
Mm-hmm.
clumsy, energetic dog. There's one person that described their manager as a kicked puppy yearning for life and approval.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
this is
Ooh.
very, very different, those to my own
Mm-hmm.
conception when I think of managers, right? And not all of them were
100%.
Yeah, not all of
Yeah.
them were negative from the member's
Mm-hmm.
perspective. I remember one person said, "Oh, my manager is the apple of my eye,"
Mm-hmm.
and described or my manager is a tree planted
Mm-hmm.
by a river. And I mean, some of these
Yep.
really inspirational and motivating.
Mm-hmm.
So it really,
Yep.
the contrast was fun. Trying to
Mm-hmm.
identify some patterns and some type of scheme to interpret these metaphors was
Mm-hmm.
as well.
Yeah. And I was just thinking of the tree by the river. I remember then, if that is the manager, then this participant said they were able to, like, they were the branches
Mhm, the
beneath.
branches.
Or yeah. So
Yeah,
like part and parcel, something life-giving, right?
yeah.
Something strong and sturdy is so different than that big clumsy dog, or worse yet, the puppy who's yearning
Hmm.
for affection and attention. Yeah, like you
Yeah.
said, we saw the scope of experiences. I think we looked at powerful managers, empowered managers, and powerless managers
Mm-hmm.
as a way to kind of to make sense of that.
Yeah. And
So go ahead.
oh, yeah. And one thing that kind of stood
Yeah.
out is like we were asking, what's
Hmm.
a metaphor for their approach to leadership, right? But it seemed like
Yeah.
so many of them, we didn't get approaches to leadership. We got like people, like we got nouns, we got
Yeah.
descriptions of the person, kind of exemplifying um, who they believe their
Hmm.
manager to be, or who the manager kind of saw themselves, right? Like, so I
Yeah.
think the metaphors did elicit something important, something that maybe like we didn't ponder enough on. I think we could go back and look at some of these things and really tease out like what does this mean, and I think it'd be interesting to get a group of managers together in like a focus group, or maybe not even a focus group, but in a conference
Yeah.
room. And I think
Yep.
they would benefit and be surprised as if they just casually discussed, metaphors of leadership and
Hmm.
the implications for those things.
Hmm. Yeah, you are so right, Scott. And as always, so insightful. So, as you said, we asked them, what is your manager's approach? And as you just pointed out, they gave us nouns, they gave us who
Hmm.
they are. And I think, yeah, between my manager as a coach or my manager as a member of the KGB, that
Yeah.
was one
Yep.
really, really stuck in my memory.
Hmm.
So yes, and I, what a fun data set to revisit and continue to explore. So another juicy question, and when I was writing these questions, I was laughing. So I'm like, of course, we really love leadership communication work. When I see this as like juicy fun, but how did the metaphors managers offer for their own approach to leading? How did that differ than the employee data set?
Mm-hmm. Well, if I remember correctly, I don't know that the managers were like, really, really positive and the members were really, really negative. I think there was a kind of
Mm-hmm.
a blend in frequency of
Yeah.
all three. And all of them, both of them
Mm-hmm.
kind of tracked similarly with we did a coding scheme of some of them really kind
Mm-hmm.
of conveyed this kind of powerful manager, some kind of this
Mm-hmm.
powerless or helpless manager, and then some
Yeah.
that were more empowering. They were kind of other focused. And
Mm-hmm.
I think the frequencies, if we when we looked at um, from the manager metaphors versus the
Mm-hmm.
member metaphors, they were quite similar. With the
Yeah.
majority of them were kind of empowering,
Mm-hmm.
positive, like coach, the
Mm-hmm.
driver, like very kind of motivating metaphors for
Mm-hmm.
for management. But there were, a good hefty number that were more negative, that were powerful and powerless. So I don't think that we could have just looked at these in terms of positive or negative, but teasing
Mm-hmm.
out like there were some differences between, say, even like powerful. So like the
Mm-hmm.
lion, and maybe this kind of gets into another question, but like the lion is a completely different metaphor depending if
Mm-hmm.
like the coworkers and the members are the cubs that the lion is protecting or the
Mm-hmm.
prey that the lion is
Yeah.
chasing, right? So
Yeah.
you got a little bit of that nuance from getting these two perspectives. And
Mm-hmm.
granted, it would be great to like do a replicate the study by asking
Mm-hmm.
the managers direct reports so we could connect.
Mm-hmm.
Like they're talking about the same person in it, but I wouldn't be
Yes.
surprised if these perceptions were different, right? So the
Mm-hmm.
way the manager sees
Certainly.
themselves
Yeah.
is not necessarily the same as the way that
Mm-hmm.
one member sees them or multiple members sees them, or there may even
Mm-hmm.
be some like variety within their work group on how like one member sees them really positively but the another person doesn't, based upon those communication exchanges, interactions, etc.
Yeah, right. Because if we think about exactly. So if someone who likes tough love, someone who's like, give me that constructive criticism, please be very direct. This is what I need. This is how I can make sense of it and respond, is so different than another person who has a really hard time with either direct communication with feedback presented in certain ways. So I think one employee might say, this is my coach. This is a person who's there on the sideline cheering for me, letting me know when I need to pivot. And another person who's like, this is my critic, or this is a dictator, right?
Mm-hmm.
Even like you're
Yeah,
saying, same manager. Yeah.
yeah.
So yeah, you hit on so many important things here, because I think you're right. This data set, when we looked at the manager first, and then we had the employee data. We're like, whoa, this is tracking in very similar ways. And I don't know that I expected that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and as you hinted on, we have this section in the publication, same but different. And you kind of talked
Mm-hmm.
about that lion. And I remember when we were going through and coding and making sense of the lion. So typically when we're doing this qualitative work and we're coding, right? If we see lion, it's going to be coded the same. But
Mm-hmm.
in this data set, it was really wildly different for many of these. So can you talk to us about how some have used that same metaphor, but to describe really different employee experiences?
Yeah, absolutely. So the lion is probably the most stark because the contrast between the lion's cubs and like the maternal instinct of a manager protecting the cubs, providing for the
Mm-hmm.
cubs in the safety, is the complete opposite of the relation to a lion as being the prey that has to always be on guard. I mean, I think of like those, like, a
Yeah.
wildebeest that's like, just reacting whenever the presence of the manager comes around. They're perked up and
Mm-hmm.
they're getting ready to run. Um, but that wasn't the only difference. There was like the pilot, where some responses viewed the coworkers, the team as the co-pilots or the flight attendants, whereas others described the members as cargo, or in one case,
Yeah.
casualties, implying a plane wreck,
Oh,
like a
yeah.
crash.
Yep.
So you really did see that it wasn't like one metaphor was entirely good or entirely bad, but the meaning associated with it, and these associations were based on experiences with the
Yeah.
individual. So some people loved the structure of like a sergeant or colonel, because they were supportive, they were protective, they were organized, where then others described them more as like power hungry dictators. So
Yeah.
a parent, even, like the parent as like a leader. Some people viewed the parent in these positive, nurturing, caring ways, whereas others like condescending and controlling. Like it's like a parent, they're inhibiting my autonomy. Or in
Yeah.
contrast, just like a good parent, they're like guiding me and like setting me up for learning, or whatever it is. So I was a little interested to find that even though the same word or metaphor is being used, it really is grounded in the experience with that person to determine what that association is. And again, it kind of points out, like, metaphors, they draw our attention to some things, but then kind of background other things. So there's certain parts of, these different metaphors that are kind of become a little bit more salient or more emphasized than others. Made it take a little bit more time kind of going through this
Yeah.
data. Like, what do we have here? But really, as we
Yeah.
started like going through it and going through it again and picking up things, we're like, whoa, like this is really interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. And I love that you brought up the pilot example, because again, okay, my manager is like a pilot, but I'm part of the crew, or I'm a flight attendant. We work together. We're on the same team. And then we switch, my manager's a pilot, but I'm cargo. Okay. I'm along for the ride. I've lost my agency autonomy, but not necessarily dangerous. But then when I'm a casualty, right? My managers literally led me to mayhem. So, yeah, as you point out, how powerful metaphors can be in helping us to understand someone else's experience. So, for me, I love behavioral research. I love variables. I love doing the statistics and looking at those patterns. But there is something that we do miss when we don't look at these interactions at this particular level and through a qualitative lens.
Yeah, and I think part of the fun with this was it helped us to think. Like, we're trying to, like, how do you make sense of this? And
Yes. Yep.
because being familiar with like different leadership theories and different approaches, I mean, I find both of us were still trying to identify some type of patterns or models, which I think
Yeah.
we'll get into a little bit later. But the nice thing about, things can get messy when we're looking for things that emerge from the ground up. But in
Yep.
some cases, if it happens to match the data, things that emerge might help you realize, ooh, I think we found a model that we can now test if this is translate to
Yeah.
different contexts. If we did it again, would we find similar results? So again, I'm rambling now, but I think this was great for inspiring some different types of thinking regarding like leadership theory and practice, and like, wow, like, how do I apply prior knowledge in light of the pictures I'm getting from this data?
Exactly. And that is a perfect lead on to this next question. Because one thing that I'm really proud of in this work that we did in this publication, when we're thinking about the discussion. So, non-academic folks, our discussion, I always think about this is how we tie it together with a nice bow. We return to our introduction where we say, hey, this is why it's important. Here's the problem that we're addressing, or here's the gap we're trying to fill. We return to the scholarly literature to say this is what's been done, but this is how what we've done has increased what we know, or complicated what we know, or changed what we know. So these discussions, we typically will look at them theoretically, again, to speak to the scholarly literature, but then also pragmatically. What does this mean for folks in organizations, for our managers out there, for our employees out there? And Scott, when we got to this, you had this ingenious idea of how to map the metaphors. And we created a table and we looked at how the metaphor was used to describe power over people and power over environment, right? We could be high or low on both of those. So, and for us, this became a way to understand those fundamental differences on these metaphors and what this might mean for this type of enactment of leadership and communication. So can you talk to us about this, that, the power over people and power over environment? What does this mean for
Mhm.
employees?
Sure. And this was kind of my attempt of just trying to, like I said, I like problem solving. I like figuring out puzzles. So this was an attempt to how can we make sense of these things? Because on the one hand, leaders and members both desired a powerful leader. But on the other hand, it was kind of like there were contingencies on how that power was used, whether or not you admired the leader or whether or not you were afraid of the leader. So this was kind of like an easy 2x2. So we've all encountered a leader or a manager that uses their power to, control, potentially command people, right? The dictator leadership. I mean, I don't know that anyone likes it. I don't know anyone likes performing it, but sometimes things need to get done. So it exists as, kind of like a go-to. Some people will rely on position, or some people might rely on charisma, but the focus of the leadership is getting people to do what they want. But then there are some people that weren't as interested in that. And I kind of, from my own past, I've kind of teetered between these high, low, in my own leadership styles and in approaches, where sometimes you can structure the environment, or sometimes you can stage experiences, or you can use your expertise in order to initiate structure, how some leadership behaviors might refer to it, where you're more kind of using your power over the environment to set things up so that people can do their work. You're plowing the way, getting rid of obstacles and things, but you're not so much, using social influence or communicating with people. And I think both of these have potent effects, right? We can think of a leader that relies on high power over people and social influence, or high, almost like that strategic systems engineer that is content to be in the background. You may not even know they're there, but they're coordinating and orchestrating the whole thing. So in the low, like a kind of a laissez-faire, a monkey leading a pack of wolves, is I think the example we put under that. Yeah, they're there. I mean, maybe less interesting, or maybe more interesting, but we kind of just dismissed, okay, this is probably not desirable. So let's move on to what
not going to be so successful.
Yeah, not going to be successful as a monkey leading a pack of wolves. Maybe you need to take the exit for a time and regroup. But then the high power over people with high power over environment, there seemed to be some like the athletic coach or an orchestra conductor that seemed to have expertise, and seemed to have an ability to coordinate systems, that knew the environment. So a coach knows the rules of the game, has developed strategies, has watched film of the other team, knows the situation. And I think a coach is admired because of their acumen in taking command over the situation, but also knowing where to put people, knowing how to use people. So that was kind of some of the thinking behind this. Of course, you and I, we have to put that high box. We have to call it communicative leadership, because
of course, what else would it be, Scott?
We're just some fans of. We're a little biased in how we approach things. But I think to get at the heart of what we're trying to do here, explaining some of the differences between a parent that is like the parent that has no power over, say the situation, the peer group, and is only just trying to direct the individual, might come off as constraining or controlling. But, there's a parent that might think, what does my child need to be successful? And they might set the child up I mean, you don't want too much. You don't want to like just, I've heard the phrase lawnmower parent, where you just, mow down a path
Oh,
for them to go.
yeah.
But I think by having some expertise, having some influence both over environment and over people in a more balanced and constructive way seems to be like, I don't think a lot of employees or members have a problem with leaders and managers using power. I think it's expected, but it seems to be in a more balanced way, in a more constructive way. And the things that stood out to me were how some of the leaders were admired. And I know, I'm interpreting this through my own experiences. I don't necessarily like when people have power over me, but when they take command over the situation, right? Don't we just look up to people that maybe in adversity, they appear unfazed. I have uncertainty. I don't know what's going on, but you look to the manager and it just appears like they're not concerned, because they're like, no, I got this situation, been here before. And so I think like kind of the interplay between those two, I don't know that we did, I don't know that we did a thorough, unpacking of this. There's probably more to think about, but that kind of goes into the thinking of what I had in mind when we were discussing it and trying to map it out.
Yeah. Yeah, certainly. Another follow-up. And I think when you were talking, I was thinking about the communication competence required for someone in that high quadrant, right? That someone who can power over people. Again, we can think about it in so many different ways, but with the positive, and I love the coach analogy that you teased out there. It's recognizing, because of my experience, because I know this game, because I've studied the other team and these different strategies, and because I know my people so well. I know I can move this person to this position and give them a little time, and they're probably going to grow. And if it doesn't fit, they're going to be okay if I move them back. And recognizing another player, nope, got to leave them right there. This is what's going to be best for them. And so that's a really helpful and healthy way of looking at power over people through communication. I think you're right. Your communication too, if we want to exercise power over an environment, we have to be an incredibly complex communicator, because it probably means connecting across departments. It means being able to think strategically about the resources we need and how we want to use them, and communicating that vision in a persuasive way, in a compelling way. So again, I think it just really highlights those in managerial, title leadership positions, that communication competence is that ongoing skill we have to continue to grow and to hone and to work on, because it's just going to help us be more successful. Yeah. So, Scott, with this, considering this work, what are some practical suggestions for our titled leaders? And is there a particular metaphor that they should strive for that is better than another?
This is a good question. And I think I could go a variety of different directions. And I think first, the thing that comes to mind, now that we get into practical suggestions, so now we're into the world of the manager, where they are asked/required to wear a lot of hats. They probably don't have near the amount of time that they would wish to kind of sit back like we're doing. Just let's reflect on, approaches and metaphors. It'd probably be great to. But most managers that I know and interact with, time is not their friend. They have a series of meetings. They have too much information, not enough time to process it. They're making decisions. They're doing a lot of things. So first off, hats off to all of you managers that
100%
are busy doing it. So with that in mind, I'm going to try to make practical suggestions that are less like, oh my goodness, look at these academics talking. So I'll try to.
Exactly. Yeah.
They just don't know. So I think one thing that I think a manager should walk away, or maybe they already know this, there is not one ideal metaphor for leadership. So I know lots of books that I've read from popular press, they're like, try to promote a certain style, or here's some helpful. And I spent a couple years trying in search of my ideal leadership type, or my ideal forms of leadership. And I'm just not so sure one exists. I think you could be an effective bear. You could be an effective conductor. You could be an effective pilot. You could be, I mean, maybe even an effective monkey once you learned how to lead a pack of wolves.
Exactly. Yeah.
So I think that not getting caught up on what's the ideal, but looking at things practically in terms of how am I communicating with people and what is their experience with these interactions. So one thing that stood out to me is, if you're focusing on what's my ideal form of leadership, and maybe if you were to answer the question, what metaphor is your best represents your approach to leadership? I mean, this is a good exercise, but you might find that these are very aspirational and ideals. But to note that, to ask yourself the question, I wonder how my direct reports would describe my approach to leadership. And it might be the case that they have no idea. They're not describing your approach to leadership. They're just creating some broad picture of who you are based upon the positive or negative experiences they've had with you. So for me, I think if you draw attention to these simple questions of is my desired approach to leadership, would my direct reports view me as doing that or doing something different? I mean, that could be interesting, conversation.
Yeah.
For sure. And then the other thing is, again, I don't think there's an ideal form of leadership, but narrowing things down to how am I communicating? And it doesn't mean that you have to communicate more. And this is like a different topic, but some other areas of research I'm interested in is the calibration of communication, because when we look at just more or less, we don't get at whether or not there's a sweet spot. Communication is good to a point, but then too much of a good thing might not be worthwhile. So I think there's lots of things in leadership that maybe it'd be worthwhile for managers to think, how much is the right amount? In addition to maybe the looking at these metaphors in terms of how their self-understanding might be similar or different, or even different among the people they lead. They're viewed differently, and asking why might that be? I think those. Again, I tried to be concrete, but there I go, reflecting on these abstract metaphors.
No, you're right. I mean, because there's just so many tangible, helpful suggestions we could pull from here. And I love the idea that I think raising up that idea of what would my team say? What would their metaphor be? And is that something that I'm striving for? Is that something that I feel good about? And as you noted, I think the number one question I'm asked is a leadership communication scholar from, people at soccer or the grocery store, family members, is what is the best leader? What type of style should I be? And I'm like, none. You should be a Scott leader, right? You should be a Leah leader. You need to lean into the best parts of your natural abilities and figuring out, what are my strengths? What are areas for improvement? Because then we have authenticity, right? We are genuine, because when we are trying to act like a democratic leader, if that's not ours, or it's our interpretation of it, there is an ick factor, right? Because our people know that this just doesn't feel quite right, right? So thank you for touching on all of that. And you're right, that Goldilocks level of communication is a hard one to find, but the more time we spend with people, we recognize, okay, this person needs a little bit more. This equips them to be the best employee they can in this role. And there are others, I'm thinking of Jan's work, where he found the higher your leader-member relationship, often you have less communicative exchanges because you understand each other. You're working from the same shared space of knowing. So, right. Thank you, Scott. So now I want to shift gears. So we spent a lot of time talking about our manager metaphor publication. And now I want to look at what the work that you're doing as you finish your PhD. So can you tell us in layman's terms what you're exploring?
Sure. So curiosity has led me on a variety of topics. And As you know, the socialization of new members to organizations is something I've long been fascinated with. It has all of the elements of growth and development, of adjustment, of communication. So that's an area that I've been honing in on. And a lot of past work, the audience might know, has been interested in how organizations kind of structure the experience of new employees. So we think of onboarding. You think of those early, trainings, those early things. But what we're looking at, and some of the earliest essays on socializations, like in 1960s, Brim and Wheeler talked about the importance of when a new member that's exposed to role models from the work group that they'll be working with. And although I think many have noted that, really it's the day-to-day work group that exerts a lot of the influence to help a person adjust and socialize to the norms and practices of that they need to learn. A lot of the research has looked at what is the organization doing, or complemented that with the individual newcomer. How does their proactivity, the extent to which they go about seeking information and things, how does that help? So what we're looking to do is extend that to focus in on the everyday work group. So if you go to work, chances are the HR department isn't shaping your norms, but it's the
Yep. We really hope they aren't.
Yeah,
What is going on?
Yeah, they gave you some information. They helped orient you to the organization, providing information about the history, the culture, filling out those forms for getting your benefits in order, and all of the things that need to take place before you start your job. But when you're actually doing your job, that's such a rich context for social learning, from role modeling. And I think too, let's face it, if we have pressure to get things done, it likely may come from the peers that we're working with. So I know it's a little bit broad. I won't get into the technical details. But to sum up, I guess I'm interested in both that work group as the context that new members of organizations kind of grow and adjust. And also the kind of the influences that work group has, whether it's normative social influence, whether they're using information or communication, just kind of that's kind of the ballpark with which I'm playing.
Yeah, and so important because, like you said, we think about socialization, we think about onboarding. What is it, 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, maybe tops, and then go ahead. You are ready to spread your wings and fly. And the research that I love, leader-member relationships, peer relationships at work group is so pivotal in shaping what work feels like. Right. So I love that you're going to explore that entry in that perspective, because again, we kind of act like it happens in a silo, this HR silo, and then we're like, nope, we're good. And so really, really important contributions to the literature, and then the takeaway. So that's my next question is the follow-up. So tell us why this is important and what takeaway lessons you think could come from this that would help employees in very real ways.
Yeah. So I think it's important to just simply answer the question, does the socialization of a new member, is it different depending on the work group that they're part of? So if you have a really high performing and supportive work group, where if you have kind of a low performing or maybe a high performing but very low supportive group, that experience is going to be different. So that's one way. How much does it matter? Because we know that sometimes people will thrive because of their individual kind of proactivity, the go get them. So it may be that if you're a really high engaged and proactive person, it may not matter as much. But for if you're looking to take someone who is just learning, but you want to socialize them so that they become really high performing, maybe this is more relevant to that. And then the second question is, what type of communication are they going to experience that really makes the difference? So this is where I'm looking at kind of a simple framework that I used to use when I was a leader. Did a lot of mentoring and a lot of coordinating of different groups. And what I tried to look at were these three aspects of like challenge, feedback, and support. So
Okay.
every I think you'll appreciate this from like the LMX standpoint, because
Yep.
you're interacting with different people that all have various thresholds of challenge. So like you can't challenge everyone the same. Everyone doesn't need the same amount of feedback or support. So like you mentioned, if like a person's transferring in, they have different needs than a person who just graduated college and is integrating into their first time career type job. So I'm interested, like what type of messages, what type of communication challenges a newcomer a little bit beyond their comfort zone, maybe like messages that convey high standards or accountability or things along that. But then does the new member, to what extent do they have quality feedback from members of their work group, to let them know how they're doing, where they're standing, how they could grow? And then the third, I mean, social support becomes such an important part, especially in these uncertain environments where people have to learn, right? They're already, I mean, many new members are already a little hesitant. They're a little tentative. They don't want to be perceived or viewed as being less competent. They want to prove that they can do it. So a work group that conveys supportive messages, those are kind of my three ingredients, so to speak. That We'll see. We'll find out how to measure them. We'll look at them and we'll see if is there any difference between work groups within the same organization, and are there some commonalities that, like, hey, generally speaking, you know, these three things will help facilitate newcomers' learning and adjustment to their role.
Yeah, so interesting. And I mean, we can think about it, of course, the humanistic perspective. This is right to do for employees, right? But then if you don't want to, if that's not your lens, if we want to look at this from a more managerial HR cost perspective, reductions in turnover, right? Retaining employees. So I think you know, any way we look at it, we can see clear value to this work that you're doing. So to be continued.
Yes. Hey, thank you.
Yes. So, Scott, I have two final questions for you. As you know, on the Communicative Leader, we like to leave listeners with pragmatic leadership or communication tips. I was thinking, you know, you're a longtime listener, first-time guest. From that perspective, let's think of our titled leaders first. So, what is the tip, advice, or challenge you would like to leave them with?
Wow. So I'm not going to assume that I have incredible technical competence at management, but I've read a ton on leadership. I've been in leadership positions. In something that I think is more important, that might often get overlooked because it's not a tactic, is I would encourage titled managers to find someone to talk to. You know, have a person in your life, whether it's like a formal coach that you schedule every 2 weeks, or if it's like another manager, like someone who experiences the similar things, that you can just spend 15 minutes, 20 minutes every now and then talking about your experience. I think that is a form of communication that I haven't read a ton of articles about, but I think would be really interesting, is the extent to which managers have a network of similar peers with similar responsibilities that they can, you know, talk shop with. In one of those meetings, I think it'd be fun. Like, wouldn't it be fun, managers, to kind of tease out in 5 minutes, 10 minutes, like, wow, what are some of the metaphors that would describe or exemplify some of these, maybe not the approach, but some of the different approaches over the years that you've tried in this very challenging task of getting people to do their work, to treat each other fairly, to be both productive and supportive, and in all of the other things that to motivate them, all of the things that you have. I'm sure you've tried a lot. So I hope this exploration of metaphors might prompt some kind of fun, interesting, maybe even funny conversations that you might have with other managers.
Yeah, I love that response, Scott. So when I was also thinking, even because we know this being in that titled position, it can be lonely. We're not able, there's certain information we can't share with our team. And that can be a heavy burden. And so we have that connection there. We can access support. I was just asked, I received an email asking for an episode entitled "You Don't Have to Do It Alone" from the manager's perspective,
Yeah,
this idea of support. But I was also thinking in really hard times, if, there's an extra stressful season, having these managers being like, my team's being a bunch of monkeys right now. What's your team being? Right. So
yeah,
we
yeah,
could even flip it in a way to
yeah.
let off some pressure and to, just connect over those shared
Sure.
similarities. I love that idea, Scott.
Yeah.
No one has ever made that recommendation on the communicative leader.
Mm.
So really great insight.
And maybe like
Yeah.
if your audience wants to
Mm-hmm.
engage and reach out, maybe we can flip the script a little bit and ask what
Mm-hmm.
metaphor for employee slash direct report, like the some literature would talk about follower behavior or followership.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
what metaphors come to mind when you think of those you lead? That could be kind
Mm-hmm.
of another interesting discussion.
Yeah. Yeah. 100% to explore it from that perspective. And so, what's coming next? My last question. So, we've talked about our formal titled leaders. What about all our other employees across industries, across ranks? What
Mhm.
advice, tip, or challenge related to leadership or communication do you
Mm-hmm.
want to leave them with?
Okay, so this, I would think, so say you have a manager, you have no control over who they are. You work for an organization and you don't get to choose who the leader or the manager is. Um, I, I, I would recommend and there's some, this is another research area of interest for me
Mm-hmm.
is or how leaders communicate, how managers communicate to
Mm-hmm.
those they lead. But I think there's less on how do effective um, employees or members or followers communicate with their manager. And I think often there's the idea that whoever has the most status needs to be the most proactive, like the
Mm-hmm.
responsibility for managing the
Yep.
relationship
Yeah.
falls to them. But
Mm-hmm.
I'm tinkering around with measuring this idea called communication acumen that the
Mm-hmm.
employer, the direct report would have, where if you can learn to
Mm-hmm.
understand like what your leader or manager is really about, what are their goals, what are they trying to do, and
Mm-hmm.
you can communicate in a way that establishes consistency with them. So if you understand,
Mm-hmm.
you likely have preferred communication styles or patterns, as does
Yeah.
your manager. So if you can maybe take on some of the proactivity of
Mm-hmm.
understanding the way that the manager prefers to receive information,
Mm-hmm.
prefers to share information, and if you can understand like what they're trying to do, and you can just shift a few things in how you do your
Yep.
work to help your manager
Mm-hmm.
get wins, I think
Mm-hmm.
you will be
Yeah.
surprised how it will transform your relationship with them. And
Yeah.
you'll develop kind of this savvy, this kind of communication
Mm-hmm.
competence or acumen, which is really good. Like you're
Yeah.
scanning and monitoring the environment. You're looking, how can you behave and act in ways to not only get your individual responsibilities done, but to be not only a team player, but one that like says, hey, I want to help my team and my manager win.
Mm-hmm.
That is only going to benefit you in the long run. So it's an area that I think needs a little bit more investigation. Like, what are people doing
Yep.
like to
Mm-hmm.
that does this? But yeah, I'm thinking from a communication competence perspective. Uh, I have individual goals, but I also want to be
Mm-hmm.
kind of attentive and responsive to those around me so that I can
Mm-hmm.
achieve my own goals while helping them achieve their goals. And I think that mindset, I mean, just think of what a refreshing
Mm-hmm.
change of pace that would be if you become that person that your manager's like, oh my goodness, so refreshing. Like
Mm-hmm.
it's almost like
Yeah.
you read my mail and you knew what I needed and
Yep.
you're actually
Yep.
helping, So I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
I could go on a little bit more, but that's my 2 cents there.
Yeah. I love that it's kind of becoming the manager whisperer, the
Yeah.
person who's this ultimate team player, and they kind of mold that position for themselves through their communication,
Mm-hmm.
and then recognizing that, you know, we're all better together.
Yeah. And to be honest, I think it'll result in you, the employee or the direct report, becoming more influential within your work group.
I agree.
And
Yep.
developing the higher LMX, which so many people
Yeah,
love to have.
exactly. Scott, thank you. Thank you. Thank you for sharing your expertise, for sharing your time. You've left listeners with so many thoughtful and pragmatic tips to make their work life what they want it to be.
Oh, well, thank you for having me. It's been so fun to connect, and I can't wait till we can, touch base and hang out again.
All right, my friends, that wraps up our conversation today. Until next time, communicate with intention and lead with purpose. I'm looking forward to chatting with you again soon on the Communicative Leader.